Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a romp as well, because that's how things happen. There will be a certain amount of repetition, I think, later in the thing, which might be quite helpful. If you've got any questions, put them in the chat. I will not answer them as we go along because you've got other people to listen to, and that's quite important. So, an introduction to policy making. Whoops, getting ahead of myself here. There we go. So this is the content, the basic structure. What is policy? Who are the policy makers? How policy is made? What role can scientists play? And communication tips. So first off, what is policy? It's basically a means to achieve a goal. It's not an end in itself. So in general terms, it's a set of principles to guide actions in order to achieve a goal. And in terms of the Scottish Government, it's an objective or course of action planned by the government on a particular subject. So here's some examples. 2020 challenge for Scotland's biodiversity, Stronger for Scotland, and some bits of legislation. And the Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme. These are all policy. Some of them are also legislation. Who are the policy makers? Now, there's loads of policy makers: political parties, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, finance and business. All of these groups of people are involved in making policy. And policy is influenced by a whole range of factors, including science, but also public opinion, politics, economics, judgment, and public values. It's influenced by all of these, and none are more important than others. And as scientists, we might sometimes feel that the scientific evidence should be the final arbiter, but it isn't. So quickly to the role of the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament in policy making. Most of the issues BES members are likely to be involved with are devolved. So the relevant policies are likely to be Scottish rather than UK. And this includes the environment itself, agriculture, fisheries and forestry, agriculture, forestry and fisheries. But policy elsewhere in the UK isn't irrelevant because there's considerable discussion across the nations. And international commitments and forums are also really important to Scottish policy. It can be quite important to know the difference between Parliament and government, and that's not immediately straightforward, but basically the Scottish Parliament is made up of all the elected members of the Scottish Parliament, the MSPs, and is the lawmaking body for devolved matters. It considers any proposed legislation and scrutinises the activities and policies of the Scottish Government through debates, parliamentary questions and the work of committees. The government runs the country and is structured into a number of directorates. The directorates and their related public bodies are responsible for putting government policy into practice. How policy is made. Starting off, what's the difference between policy and legislation? Because again, this is not always entirely obvious. So policy is basically what the government plans to do towards achieving a long-term purpose or goal, and the legislation sets out the law on a matter. Policy must always comply with existing law, but it can also lead to the proposal of new laws. It may be adopted as a way of fulfilling legislative commitments, and it evolves over time under review pressures. So to take an example, and I'm using a forestry one because in my day job, I'm a woodland ecologist with NatureScot. So the Forestry and Land Management Scotland Act gave the government a duty to prepare a forestry strategy. So the forestry strategy is the policy bit. And initially a draft of the strategy was published, and there was consultation with such bodies as they consider appropriate and also with the general public. This led to the forestry strategy consultation and ultimately the forestry strategy. And I've put a couple of bits in bold because these are the points at which people including scientists, can influence policy. And it's really important to be aware of the times when you can influence policy. There's no point in writing a perfect briefing a month after the strategy's been published. So do keep an eye on timescales and the particular points when you're going to have an opportunity to contribute. These are some examples of the interested parties who were consulted specifically on the Scottish forestry strategy. And scientists are in there, but there's also lobbying organisations, including environmental NGOs, commercial organisations, landowner manager representative organisations. And the government has to take account of all these interests. As I said before, science is important, but it's not going to trump all the other interests. So going on to what influences legislation and policy, international commitments are very important. Even though we're no longer within the EU, the various directives were transposed into Scottish law. And the two forthcoming COPs, the conferences of the Party for Biodiversity and Climate Change, will be very important for influencing future policy. And Scotland itself seeks to influence COP discussions, both through the UK contribution and the way in which Scotland and Scottish priorities are presented at the COP in Glasgow. Closer to home, there are manifesto commitments, public opinion, petitions, commitments in legislation, advisory committees. So finally, and most importantly, what role can scientists play? This is quite an interesting model developed by a bloke called Pielke Jr., who's American. 4 different modes of engagement. I'm assuming there's no pure scientists who have no interest in the decision-making process here, because why would you be here? Science arbiters provide answers to questions that can be answered empirically. This includes expert committees, etc. Issues advocates involve lobbying bodies who want to promote their preferred opinion. And honest brokers try to clarify the scope of opinions and their implications. They don't say A is better than B, but they set out the likely implications of choosing A or B. And this is the way in which the BES Scottish Policy Group seeks to influence policy. We respond to consultations as an honest broker. We're trying not to give strong opinions, but to evaluate the options and the implications of those options. It's really important to understand how policymakers think if you want them to listen to you. They're not interested in detailed technical science, which scientists love. They want simple summaries, they want plain English, they want certainty, and they work to very short deadlines, hours or days. So if you want to influence them, you need to be able to respond on that order. This is an interesting article, and I'm going to put the link in the chat later, so don't try to copy it down. Top 20 things scientists need to know about policy making. Policy is difficult, and no policy will be perfect. Policy decisions are subject to extensive scrutiny, and ultimately economics and the law are top dogs. Do not say we need more research. That is the wrong answer. And if you say we need more research, that's not going to influence policy. So in summary, these are the communication tips. Simplify, keep it brief, make it relevant, be certain about where there is uncertainty and focus on the evidence. Be timely, tell a story, and keep it short. And don't forget, why does it matter? What's the so what factor? So here's a summary of how you turn your science into policy. Aim for evidence-informed policy, establish your role, know how policy works, communicate effectively, and that means effectively for policymakers, which, as I say, isn't the same as communicating effectively for scientists, and answer the right questions. So that is me. I think I have now stopped screen sharing. And I will hand over, whoops, I will hand over now to Nick Bibby.
Thanks very much, Jeanette. That was really great, actually. It's a great summary of how engaging with policy works. I'm going to talk now about one of the tools you might use in that process. So there are lots and lots of different tools you can use to engage with policy, and as Jeanette mentioned, you want to pick things that are appropriate to the situation. There isn't a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. I'm going to talk today about how to write what's termed a policy brief, but you can engage with policymakers through all sorts of ways. There are formal processes such as parliamentary and government inquiries. You can engage with people through social media, through writing blogs, through the print and broadcast media. There's all sorts of ways of doing it, but I'm going to focus on this one today. So I've got a few slides. Let me just, there we go. Hopefully you can all see that. So this is actually cobbled together from a slightly longer presentation on several tools that you might use. And I'll maybe send around the full presentation afterwards. But the key thing that always comes out of any type of communication, actually with any audience at all, not just a policy audience, is you're thinking always about a balance between the message, what it is you're trying to say, and the audience you're trying to reach. Okay, so the message, you don't need to read through all of this. You want to be as precise on this as you possibly can. And in a policy brief, that's going to be focusing in on a policy question. As Jeanette mentioned, it's not about giving us kind of exhaustive overview of the available science. It's about thinking, well, what do policymakers need to take away from this? So the message can be quite precise, and you want to spend quite a time thinking through what is it that I'm trying to say. And once you've clarified what that is, do feel free to bang on about it. You don't want to sort of hope they pick it up in the third sentence of the fifth paragraph. You want to be quite explicit about the message that you're trying to get across. Think about your audience. And again, this applies to any form of communication. What does your audience already know? Yeah, so don't think quite clearly about everything you can find out about them. Yeah, what do they already know? How do they tend to acquire knowledge? What are their interests? Yeah, so what questions for them are you going to need to address? Critically, as Jeanette said, why should they care? Right? Why if you ever get the opportunity to spend some time in a parliamentarian's office, it's really interesting to do, and it's worth taking the time to have a look at their inbox. The tonnage of information that goes through policymakers' offices is astonishing. We'll be hearing later from Graeme Cook from SPICE, and one of the things SPICE do is present the absolute masters of presenting huge bodies of knowledge in a way that busy policymakers can digest really quickly, because they go through that process of thinking through, okay, well, what do these people need to know on this topic? This isn't our opportunity to have an interesting chat about something, however important that might be. So once you've made that decision about what is the message, who am I trying to speak to, that will then tell you which tool you need to use. So sometimes that tool might be, a press release, or it might be a tweet, it might be a short film, it might be all sorts of things, but it's going through the iterative process of what am I trying to say, and who am I trying to say it to, will eventually help you to work out what the medium is. Quite often when communicating with policy, it will be a thing called a policy brief. So what is a policy brief? One of the critical aspects here is that they are brief. The clue's sort of in the question, but 2 to 4 pages, written in a professional but non-academic style. So it can often be really, really difficult for scholars because so much of the training goes into thinking about how to write for peer review, thinking about how to write for academic audiences, and you've got to step back from that and write in what I sometimes refer to as basic human. Yeah, so the people you are writing for may well be experts on the topic, but from a different perspective, from a policy perspective. So you need to avoid using too much jargon, explain terms where appropriate. But keep it short and to the point. The other bit of a policy brief, of course, is that it's about policy. So you want to address a particular policy topic. So in this, you're probably looking at a particular question rather than perhaps talking about the findings of a study as a particular study, or looking across a research area as a whole. You're focusing in on a particular question, saying, well, how does this study or this body of knowledge apply to this particular question? And you're looking at something that's a live policy issue at any given time. So the first two things to take away, a policy brief, it's brief and it's about policy. The final bit is policy briefs are about the evidence. You can draw conclusions, and indeed a policy brief, and I'll mention these other ones in just a moment, is slightly different from what are sometimes called evidence briefs or research briefs, in that you can make recommendations in this, but those recommendations should draw quite naturally from the evidence that you're presenting, so that it's not, oh, here's some evidence, here's some research we did, and here are some things that I think. Okay, so you want to ground it quite clearly in the evidence, but you're addressing a policy question. What distinguishes a policy question from a research question or from any other type of question? The answers to policy questions can be implemented in the world. Okay, so there may well be conclusions that you draw. Now, sometimes those conclusions are self-evident. I often use the example that if you're not presenting conclusions, you're writing a research brief, you might say that the evidence suggests that more cycle paths and walkways improve public health, as indeed it does. You would stop there. If you were making recommendations, you would then go on to say, therefore, local authorities should build more cycle paths and walkways. But so often the recommendation is self-evident, but not always. So in a situation like this, you would be making recommendations. So let's have a quick look at what the actual document itself would look like. Always put an executive summary in, and increasingly, actually, I encourage people to use a summary of the summary. So the brief in brief, just put a little box up at the top with a one sentence or two short sentence summary of the whole document. But as I say there, the exec summary is usually the thing you write last. So you'll plan it out, write it, and then when it's absolutely clear what you're saying, you go back and write the bit at the beginning last, somewhat counterintuitively. You then have the introduction, and this is really where you grab people's attention. Why does this issue matter? Why are you writing about it now? Why is it important? What policy issue does this speak to? Does it speak to a piece of legislation, a piece of regulatory change? This is where you provide the context of why this matters. You do put methodology in, but keep it short. It's often in academic writing, you spend a huge amount of time on this section. In writing for policy, people want to know it's rigorous, but to be honest, you're an academic at a university, they'll probably assume it's rigorous, but it's worth mentioning just so that information is there, but don't belabor the point. This is the real meat in the sandwich. I should stop using that expression actually, because I don't eat meat. So, but the results and the conclusion. Yeah. So what do we know as a result of this? So if it's focused on one study, what do we know from the study? If it's focused on a wider body of knowledge, what do we know from that? And then this part that you wouldn't have in other structures. So what are the recommendations of doing that? What do those results mean in practice? And here you want to be as specific as you can be, so that you're pinning findings to particular questions and to particular outputs. Don't assume that it is self-evident that, oh, we found this, therefore this has to happen. Now, I would absolutely be explicit through all of those steps. You don't need to, again, belabor the point too much. You're writing for an intelligent audience, but not necessarily a specialist audience. They might be. So be clear about what those implications are. And then the final part is put in references and further resources. I wouldn't actually treat this as a sort of bibliography. I would treat this as an opportunity, yes, to say, here are one or two things that support what we've said in the text so far, but you might also direct people towards blogs, to other resources from your research center, to things that they might find useful on this topic, rather than just treating it as a way of substantiating the things you've said in the document to that point. So very roughly, that's what a policy brief looks like. The key things here: focused on a particular policy question, keep it short and written in sort of professional and relatively straightforward language. I've put some other links in these slides, and as I say, I will send those round. I'm just going to be quick. Yes, indeed, the cheese or hummus in the sandwich would be much better. Sarah says it's only 10 o'clock. I'm thinking about lunch already. I know it's always a bit worrying. So as I mentioned, policy briefs are just one tool, but they are quite a handy tool. One of the people often want to be really clever with the communication tools they use. There's a reason that things like policy briefs work, and everyone's accustomed to them. So it's useful to use formats with which people are familiar. As I say, more on our website. That's me. I've forgotten who I'm handing over to. I'm sorry. It looks like Graeme.
It is, Nick. Thank you very much. Hopefully you can all hear me. My name is Graeme Cook. I'm Head of Research and Sustainable Development Scrutiny in SPICE, the Scottish Parliament Information Centre. Thank you for the invite today, and lovely to see Ellie chairing this. Ellie was a PhD intern with us until very recently, and we've still got briefings on the stocks from her that we're due to publish. And also nice to see Lydia too, who's also provided content for SPICE as well. So that's great. So I want to, can we go to the next slide, please? I want to give you a bit of an insight into some of the inner workings of the Parliament, and also actually to reinforce some of the messages from Jeanette and Nick. And also give you a little bit of an insight as to what's going on in the Parliament in relation to the biodiversity and climate emergencies. So next slide, please. So we've heard a little from Jeanette already about the role of the Scottish Parliament. This is really just to show you a photo of what it looks like. So this is the Parliamentary chamber with the presiding officer sitting in the middle there. Next up, we've got a little video, which hopefully will work online, just to go into some of that explanation about Parliament and government. Okay, it's a lot easier to do presentations when you've got technical geniuses who can produce videos like that. I hope you found that useful. And just to recap and pick up on some of the things Jeanette was talking about too. So the Scottish Government run the country, they spend the money, but they're answerable to the Parliament, and they're led by the First Minister. So that's a photo of Nicola Sturgeon there. Parliament also elects a presiding officer to oversee the workings of the Parliament, to chair the debates in the chamber and so on. And this time round that's Alison Johnson, and the presiding officer is an MSP who has to give up their party affiliation. So the Parliament's not the government, it makes the law and it agrees the budget, holds the government to account, scrutinises government activities on policy, and is led by the presiding officer. Next slide, please. So it's worth a little reflection just on knowing your audience here, and this slide represents, on the left-hand side there is a bar chart showing the 2021 election result, and showing you the different parties that are represented in the Scottish Parliament. The diagrams on the right show how that's changed through the years since Parliament's re-establishment in 1999. The point here really is that you may be talking to an MSP, but if you know you're going to be, it's useful to do a little bit of research into them so that you know which political party that they belong to. And there's lots of information on that on the Parliament website. You can find out lots about them, their register of interests, and most of them have a presence on social media as well. So relatively easy to do that sort of research. Next slide. We can just click through to the next slide. So the powers of the Scottish Parliament, again, Jeanette has reflected on some of this. It's worth considering, I suppose, that there might be areas that you think are biodiversity related, which would be naturally there in relation to environment policy and so on. But one of the things that we're trying to do in the Parliament is try and help members think more widely about where those issues might come up. What are the linkages between biodiversity and health? What are the linkages between biodiversity and transport and so on? Can we click through just once, just to get the text up, and once more? But it is true that the Scottish Parliament can pass laws on devolved matters, but can discuss absolutely anything, and the UK Parliament passes the law on reserve matters. The line between these is always an interesting area to try and work out where those powers lie. And actually for biodiversity and environment, we're finding that that's more complicated than it used to be as a result of EU exit. And that's taken a lot of our time over the past couple of years. And I'll maybe touch on that a little bit later. Next slide. So one of the key roles for MSPs is to sit on parliamentary committees who have a role to scrutinise government in some more detail. This is what a committee room looks like in normal times. Actually, quite a lot of this activity is happening remotely at the moment. All of the witnesses who are coming to committees are being heard from remotely, and I dialed into one of these committees yesterday, actually, the Net Zero Committee myself. So if we click through, we've got another wee video to show you. Okay, so the committees themselves, as the video shows you, they're small groups of MSPs. They usually meet on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday mornings, and their job is to hold inquiries into policy areas and to scrutinise and amend legislation. Actually, I was noticing when I was putting this presentation together that the photos that we've got on the right there are really unrepresentative of what happens and what should happen, in that you've got lots of men in suits there. And that's definitely something that the Parliament is working on in relation to gender balance, in relation to the committees themselves, and also those that they hear from, and diversity more widely, of course. Next slide, please. How do they carry out the activities? If we can just click through to get some of the text up, that'd be great. So you can look out for calls for views. That's committees saying we're doing a bit of work into something, tell us what you think. They can question witnesses and stakeholders on those issues. They can go on visits, question ministers, and hear from lots of other people externally. Next slide, please. So that's all fine, but how do you find out what they're up to? Well, actually, a lot of the committees are just getting up and running at the moment after the election back in May. But you can find committee web pages on the Parliament's website, which is parliament.scot. I picked out a couple here, just in relation to, well, where does biodiversity sit? Where do environmental issues sit? And actually, that's been interesting territory, because it's been a little bit unclear as to where those issues should actually sit. And you'll find that the policy responsibility for them is actually with the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee now, though of course a lot of the activities and considerations for the Rural Affairs, Islands and Natural Environment Committee will link across there as well. So this comes back to the point that where you think something might obviously sit may not necessarily be the case, so it's worth doing a little bit of looking into that. You will find that both those committees at the moment are hearing from ranges of people across their committee remits, so they'll be getting those messages from them at the moment too, and they'll be developing their work programmes, which they'll publish online, and you'll get a chance to see what they're going to be working on. Next slide, please. So SPICE, where I work, is an impartial research and library service, and we support members across the range of activities. That's a bit of an austere picture of our office, but that's in the Parliament complex in Edinburgh. Next slide. I haven't actually seen that office since March last year anyway. So who does SPICE support? We support MSPs and their staff. They can ask us inquiries. Those are confidential. They might be, a constituent might be asking them to look into the legislation around high hedges or something. Maybe the hedge of their neighbour is too high or something, right through to the policy issues of the day around things like, well, one that's live today, there's an announcement on BBC about INEOS investing in hydrogen. So we may get questions about that today, and we've actually written a couple of blogs on hydrogen, so that would help us answer those sorts of inquiries. We support committees themselves, I'll touch on that briefly again, and also support the Parliament itself in its own activities around doing better on climate change and sustainable development. And our publications are online, most of them anyway, so other people can access them. Next slide. So if we just click through here to get the text up, we work in partnership with the committee clerks, whose job it is to make sure the committee meetings actually happen. We help the committees develop their work programmes. We write and publish bill briefings, the same for policy briefings, and we can do those either talking to the committee directly, so we'll have researchers in this morning speaking to the Rural Affairs Committee, or we can do written briefings for committees too. We help them identify who they could usefully talk to. We can suggest themes of questioning, areas that they might wish to explore, and help them with appointment of advisors or commissioned research if there's areas where we don't have the in-house expertise. By the end of the day, it's the elected politicians who make the call on all of this as to what they choose to take on board, who they invite, what they ask, and all that sort of thing. Next slide. So this is just to give you a quick snapshot of our SPICE briefings web page. So the snapshot on the left is just showing you what it looked like yesterday. So we had briefings out on economic development in Scotland, labour market, some recent briefings on energy policy and so on. And on the right hand side are some more environment related recent briefings, including subject profiles on environment and climate change. So we've published these as introductions to members who may not know much about these topics or are new to being MSPs, or maybe the party spokespeople on these issues that they've never had to think so much about. Publishing other briefings on things like blue carbon, COP26, you can see it there as well. We've got another one due out that Ellie wrote on biodiversity, the biodiversity crisis, COP15 and so on as well, and we'll be publishing that soon. Next slide. Just a slight deeper dive into some of those other briefings. So the one on the right, the mainstreaming nature one, this was published at the point where the UK government, as part of the Brexit negotiations, were, you may remember, they were talking about Operation Yellowhammer. And you will all, of course, recognise that this is a Yellowhammer, a picture of a Yellowhammer. So we put that in as a nod to that. Nobody picked up on that as far as we can tell, but we know it's in there. The one in the middle and the one on the left kind of show you that we were trying to get into the detail of Brexit and what it might mean for the environment, trying to help the members unpick what the law meant in relation to what was happening post-Brexit. Things like the Scottish Government saying that they wanted to keep pace with EU law even after the UK had left the European Union. That's the sort of thing that we are grappling with at the moment, and this is the sort of thing that we produce to help members unpick that. Next slide, please. We also have a SPICE Spotlight blog, which you can sign up to. On the right-hand side there, we can see how does Scotland biodiversity measure up. Ellie wrote that one. And the pharmaceuticals and the environment one, Lydia wrote that as a SPRE, as part of an interaction with SPRE that Nick was talking about earlier. So that's great. There's an opportunity from time to time for us to bring in guest blogs, so people who bring expertise to the table that we might not be able to provide ourselves. Next slide. So the next slide relates again to our post-EU work. We've developed a Common Frameworks Hub. Common Frameworks are 4 nation agreements across the UK around how certain issues should be taken forward now that we don't have the envelope, I suppose, of the EU. That's complicated, so we're trying to create resources to help members and the officials supporting them understand these things. Happy to take any questions on any of that stuff later, but that's probably enough detail. Next slide, please. I'll possibly just skip over this because it's been covered by others already, but just to say there's a SPICE style and writing guide on our research briefings portal. So you might want to have a look at that when you want to see the types of things that we apply to our writing. Next slide. And just a couple of clicks through just to get the points up here. So this comes back to this impartiality point. We are neither political, and we're not political, and we have to be neutral in relation to the topics. Our role is to try and help assimilate, synthesize the evidence for the politicians so that they can come to their own evidence-based conclusions. That's tricky, especially in some of the territory that we're talking about. Should we reflect that climate change, that there are people who would say that climate change isn't happening? How do we talk about the fact that 99% of climate scientists, if not more, say that it is and 1% don't? You know, part of that is thinking about, or sometimes talking through with the Parliamentary Committee, that may be the case, just so that they know there are other opinions out there. But we have to work on the weight of evidence. We wouldn't give that 50-50. We wouldn't give that 50-50 both sides in a briefing, for example. Next slide. So on biodiversity and climate stuff, so this is the stuff that keeps me awake at night, as it will for all of you. I've been starting to just take snips of things that come through on the news just over the past couple of months, really. And in Scotland, you know, you'll have seen all this: hottest September days in over 100 years, reservoir levels low, the code red for humanity. And the two at the bottom right there were just last night, John Kerry saying that the promises from nations are not enough to meet the Paris Agreement effectively. And then the next one is the Chinese president saying they'll stop building coal plants overseas, which looks like a bit of a breakthrough. So that's the sort of thing that we would need to try and keep an eye on. And if we got asked about any of those things, we'd need to be able to kind of brief MSPs on that as best we could. Next slide. So all of these things can be quite overwhelming, we find. As Nick said, we get a lot of information through and have to try and assimilate that as best we can. And COP26 is a good example of so much out there, but what can we do to brief MSPs and to help them engage with it? And I've been thinking about this in the context of Glasgow's coat of arms. So this is the city's coat of arms in front of you, which has got a bird and a tree and a fish and a bell. And I quite like the idea of the bell being a call to action, a warning. And given we're talking about biodiversity, the tree and the fish and the bird, all the biodiversity indicators, you know, globally are going in the wrong direction in relation to those. And I think there's quite a nice synergy between the coat of arms itself and what might be established, what might come out of Glasgow in terms of COP itself. Next slide. So in terms of the Parliament in these emergencies, Parliaments, as you've heard, do have these unique roles to play. They're holding the governments to account. Governments can say, we're going to do these things. Who's asking the questions of them to make sure that they do? That's a role for Parliament. The climate and ecological crisis, and this is interesting actually. Are we talking about an ecological crisis or biodiversity or nature or something else? There's something in there about that consistency of message, and I suppose we struggle with that a bit ourselves. Which terminology would we use? Would we use different terminology for a different audience? That's an interesting question for policy briefs and so on. But they are increasingly discussed together. There was a net zero debate in Parliament yesterday where the Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero was talking about the climate and ecological crisis together. They're intertwined. The COPs are definitely driving a focus in the Parliament. As I mentioned, we've got Ellie's briefing coming out soon on COP15. But to finish off, I'll just tell you quickly what the Parliament's involved in at COP26. Next slide, please. So we are hosting our own COP26 Legislator Summit. So this is an in-person and hybrid event, in-person and remote event. And we hope to have hundreds, if not maybe thousands of legislators tuning into this. This will be in the middle weekend. We've got speakers such as John Kerry. We've got lots of other high-profile speakers from Global North and Global South. And we hope that that's a space to explore the unique role for Parliament and what Parliaments need to do in the climate and ecological crisis. We've also got our Festival of Politics this year, which is an online event with loads of different speakers. You can engage with that just as public, and it's themed around the Sustainable Development Goals. We've got something called The Moment. We're working with the Children's Parliament for children and young people to take their voices to their elected representatives in their constituencies. That's in advance of our Legislator Summit. And we're also working on events in Glasgow, so partnering with other organisations, including in the Blue Zone itself, in COP26, and interacting with other parliaments as well in that sort of space. So some of that is still coming to fruition, working on some of that today, but that's looking really exciting for us. And it's unusual territory for a parliament, certainly the Scottish Parliament, to be involved in these sorts of conversations, but it's great that we are. Parliament itself is taking action. We're rolling out the Royal Scottish Geographical Society Climate Accelerator training across both members and staff in the coming weeks. And we've developed a Sustainable Development Impact Assessment tool, and this is designed to support officials and MSPs in looking at a topic from different angles, from the ecological, from the environmental, from the economic, from the social, from the human rights angle, and not just look at a policy area in a siloed manner, whether that's drugs policy or transport or whatever. And we think we're the first parliament in the world to do something like that. So that's quite interesting. Next slide. And that's it from me, just a quick canter through. I hope you found some of that useful, and happy to take any questions, observations later. Thank you. Chris, I think I'm passing on to you now.
Yes, thank you very much. Hopefully you've all got my screen there. So I'm afraid I haven't got any nifty videos to as part of my presentation, but I certainly have one that I can put in the chat later. So my name's Chris Leaky, and I'm going to be I'm from NatureScot, so the Scottish agency, government agency on nature conservation, and I'll talk a little bit about how we apply science in NatureScot to inform policy and practice, but I'll mostly focus on giving evidence to Parliament, and so how we do it in NatureScot, but also how you as academics might get more involved in that sort of thing. First of all, just to better introduce myself, a little bit of about me, about my career journey. So I finished my PhD in 2006 and almost immediately left the academic world and joined NatureScot. My first job was great fun, working on a nature reserve in Shetland. Things then got a little bit more serious. I worked as an area officer in Shetland, which is a very diverse job, lots of different aspects of marine environmental management and regulation and policy. Then specialised as an inshore fisheries advisor, then on marine renewable energy, and more recently on a broad spectrum of marine planning and marine policy. And also in the last couple of years, I've been seconded to MASTS, which is the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology for Scotland, which is a research pool, essentially a membership body for most of Scotland's marine science capacity, most of the universities plus government agencies. And MASTS, a lot of its role when it boils down to it is about increasing and improving impact from science, and a whole strand of that is about policy impact. So some of what I'll say today comes from that perspective too. So much of my work has straddled this space between science and the world of policy, and something I'd stress at this point, and which Jeanette has touched on already, is that the world of policy and politics is a difficult balancing act. So decision makers not only have to be answerable to science and evidence, but they're also trying to weigh up public opinion, lobbyists, whatever the business priorities of the moment are, and maybe there's some legal obstacles or international relations they have to consider. So the science alone is not always enough. So the best we can do is to try and make that scientific evidence as compelling as possible. So in NatureScot, we use data and we use knowledge, both accumulated knowledge and emerging knowledge. And we have some of our own data, but we're often using other people's data. So my first sort of bit of advice, I suppose, to you as academics is, where possible, get your data into public holdings. This might mean data archive centres and meeting metadata standards. So think about this when you're writing grant applications or meeting data ethics requirements. Whose knowledge are we tapping into? So we do have our own specialist advisors and scientists, but they don't know everything, and they certainly don't have time to keep on top of all of the academic literature. So for them, retaining links with go-to academics is really important. Unless your work is particularly cutting edge, or you're really very forthright about making those and building those contacts and relationships, that's probably more likely to be very senior experienced academics, but you might find ways to be able to offer to help them or to shadow them when they're getting involved in policy work. You've also heard a little bit about some of the opportunities through SPRE and BES to kind of get involved with policy interaction, and they've definitely encouraged those. Our advisors also link quite closely with research pools like MASTS, and that's a really, really great way for academics, including early career researchers, to get involved with policy interaction, and I'm going to come back to talk about that. You can, of course, also look for internships and secondments, graduate placement schemes. We have quite a successful one now in NatureScot. Other agencies have them. Government itself has similar things as well. So look out for those opportunities. And these things can really provide you with a first-hand experience, or at least a front row seat, to be able to experience how we apply science to policy and practice. And oh, my slide has jumped forward, sorry. And yeah, so, and these in the boxes in red are the kinds of things that we're trying to use science to influence. And I'd particularly draw your attention to the difference, the distinction between policy making and policy implementation. Okay, so let's take a look at the preparation of written evidence. How do we do it in NatureScot? And how might you be involved as academics, so written evidence to Parliament? For us, this generally means gathering advice and insights from a range of specialists within NatureScot and consolidating it down into something very succinct. So the main skill here is actually an editorial one. But as you get more experience of a diversity of topics and of the policy landscape in broad terms, you can start to do this much more efficiently. So as I've grown in confidence and experience and learned a sufficient amount about some of these specialist topics and a greater overview of that policy landscape, what I now do is I actually prepare my draft response before reaching out to our specialists. And that means they've got much less reading to do, and I can ask them very specific questions on the things I need help with. So that's just more efficient for everybody, really. But that comes with experience. Of course, you as academics don't necessarily have this organizational structure to gather around. So how can you make your parliamentary advice and evidence well considered? And knowing that the policy landscape is important, how can you pull that in? So I would say really the answer is to work with others. And as we've said, you might be able to build one-to-one professional relations with policy advisors, but that can take time. You might be able to keep on top of policy material, but that can be a lot of reading. And I think for a lot of academics, it's probably unrealistic to expect you to do that alongside, research and teaching roles, for example. So personally, I'm a great advocate for the role of research pools like MASTS in bringing academics, industry and policy advisors together around topics. So if we look at MASTS, it has forums on 12 topics. These all bring academics and public bodies together. Some of these have, coordinated the writing of evidence to Parliament or sent representatives to committee sessions to give verbal evidence, and some have even been commissioned by Parliament to provide a report, for example. I think there's lots of unused potential for Parliament to tap into this organised sort of structure of expertise across science and policy. And so I would encourage you to get involved in research pools, get involved in their forums, and to propose joint responses to parliamentary consultations. MASTS is just one of these research pools. SAGES is another that covers the earth sciences. But in Scotland, we're actually really lucky. We have 10 research pools that cover a huge diversity of topics. And you can go to Research Innovation Scotland, which is sort of the umbrella body that where you can find those. So moving now to a little bit on style and structure and content of written evidence, and what you've heard from others covers some of this, and so I'll just add some emphasis. First of all, I would say avoid lobbying. Advocacy, as Jeanette, can be said as, Jeanette said advocacy can be fine, but I'd say very strongly stay science grounded for your own integrity as a scientist. Be constructive, by all means, identify challenges where things have gone wrong in the past, but always try and come with solutions. Then for anything beyond the immediate scope of the questions being asked in a consultation, add an extra section so it's clear that it's distinct from the questions they have deliberately thought to ask. And you might also want to provide supporting information in an annex, and that helps keep the main body of the evidence, the advice, succinct. Express uncertainty with care. Now, again, Jeanette covered some of this. As scientists, we can be too quick sometimes to refer to what we don't know. And I think it's very important that we start first on what we do know, we focus on that. And for this and other tips on handling uncertainty, I would point you to this uncertainty handbook. I'll put a link to this in the chat afterwards. This was designed for climate science communication, but actually can apply very broadly. Next in my purple boxes here is to highlight links to other policy areas. This is something that Graeme referred to, actually, the linkages between policy areas, and we refer to this sometimes as policy coherence. So, for example, if you're giving advice on sustainable food systems, for example, you could point out how the right decisions there can also support public health or employment opportunities, or how better education policy could help drive public support for sustainable food systems. You can also go even further and trying to make it relevant to current government priorities. And this is where having someone, as part of your team and pulling advice together who's familiar with the policy landscape can really help. But at the very least, I would say be familiar with the current government priorities, and that's the PFG, the Programme for Government, as an annual document that lays out the priorities for that parliamentary year. Writ large here, less is more, because I can't emphasize this enough. As others have said, keep it succinct, keep it precise. The people reading this stuff have a lot to get through, so they need to get to the key messages really quickly. And credentials, by all means, make sure you write down why you and this group you're working with are people that deserve to be listened to. Okay, so what about preparing for giving verbal evidence yourself, or preparing a brief for a senior colleague, which is often the case for me, how I would do it. If you've been invited to give verbal evidence, you've probably already given written evidence. So you've already got a starting point for preparing your notes. So amongst my top tips, again, less is more. Keep things short and simple, use bullet points, highlight the really important messages and avoid jargon, but absolutely do provide links to other materials that you or who you're providing the briefing for can go a little deeper in the preparation to consultation documents and your previous written response, for example. Be prepared. Know the session focus. You can get this information from the committee clerks and know who the other panel members are going to be. You can also then start to anticipate the sensitive issues and aligned and conflicting views. You can do some background research on who the MSP committee members are, the things that are close to their hearts, the questions they often ask, what likely is of concern to their constituencies, for example. You can also check the evidence being submitted by others in written evidence, including the panel members who would be sitting next to you. Are there things you want to reinforce or perhaps even to contradict? And you might also be able to arrange to talk to some of the other panel members before the committee session. That can be really useful preparation too. And consider if you have any short case examples to hand. You might be asked in a committee session for an example on the practical application of a piece of research. So keep those things handy. And finally, I would just say, be open to offering additional written evidence. Committee sessions can be time constrained, but it's not that unusual for a committee member, an MSP, to, their interest to be piqued by something you've said, but you might be able to offer something a little deeper through additional written evidence after the committee session. Also, recognise that the questions you want to be asked will not always come up. So be prepared to give the answer you need to give, even if it's not the question you were asked. And so there's a little bit of, of learning from politicians there, I think. And that, I think, is it from me. And just to say, that last point reminds me, I had the dubious pleasure of being in the public gallery when Donald Trump was giving evidence in relation to the wind farm proposal for next to his golf course. And that was a very fine example of how not to give evidence to Parliament. And you can probably find, it might still be available on Parliament TV. I'm not sure if the recording of that is still up there.
Thanks very much for inviting me to speak. Everyone, I'm just going to point to the chat really quick. I shared a link for a video that I'll be showing in my presentation. So just so everyone has access to that. And yeah, just let me share my screen really fast. Okay, so hopefully you guys are all seeing my PowerPoint slides. And yeah, I'll just kick off. My name's Lydia Niemi, and I'm speaking about my policy engagement story. So environmental monitoring and policy, a journey from Scotland's Highlands to the capital city. So I'll start with a brief background about myself. So I recently finished my PhD at the Environmental Research Institute, and that's located in Thurso, Caithness, which is the northernmost tip of the mainland UK. I received a competitive scholarship from the Scottish Government's Hydronation Scholars Programme to research pharmaceutical pollution in the environment. And I am now for the One Health Breakthrough Partnership, which is a group addressing pharmaceutical pollution and the environmental impacts of our healthcare practices in Scotland. So I'd like to give a little context now about my research and the work that I'm currently doing. So pharmaceuticals are a class of emerging environmental contaminants, and they are extensively used in everyday life. So more than 103 million prescription items were dispensed in Scotland between 2018 and 2019. And this demonstrated an approximate 40% increase over the last 15 years. And over-the-counter sales have reached more than 2.5 billion in the UK in 2017. And as a result of this continuous use, these compounds enter waste streams in large quantities, either following ingestion and excretion or direct disposal, which is shown in this picture here. So waste from homes, hospitals, and businesses is treated at municipal wastewater treatment plants. But since wastewater treatment plants are unable to fully remove pharmaceuticals from surface water, these compounds have a direct pathway into surface water. There are several unknowns here and the potential effects in the environment. However, pharmaceuticals are biologically active compounds, and even at low concentrations, they may result in ecotoxicological effects in non-target organisms. And some examples here include feminization of male fish and also the promotion of the spread of antimicrobial resistance in bacteria in the environment. So my PhD sought to fill knowledge gaps around the introduction and presence of pharmaceuticals in rural surface water and wastewater in Scotland. So rural regions such as the Highlands, they may face challenges relating to wastewater management and environmental pollution, as wastewater is generally treated at smaller and less advanced wastewater treatment plants. So as a result, surface water may be at risk due to stress from growing urbanization and pollution. This includes, for example, like drinking water abstraction, wastewater and septic tank discharge, agricultural activity, and land use patterns. And additionally, some of these impacted waterways may be special areas of conservation as designated by SEPA for certain species, including otter, salmon, and the endangered freshwater pearl mussel. So I'm going to heard from already, and it tells about my PhD story performing this research and the path it set me on to engage with policy stakeholders and stakeholders in Scotland. So I hope you can all hear it. If not, please follow the link and watch it on the Vimeo site. So you saw from this video how I journeyed from the Highlands to the Scottish Parliament, and I met with Graeme from the Scottish Parliament Information Centre and Lizzie as well from the Scottish Parliament. And as Graeme mentioned earlier, I wrote a blog for SPICE, which highlights the issue of pharmaceutical pollution in the environment in Scotland and also the policy implications around this issue. So this blog introduces the cross-sector group, the One Health Breakthrough Partnership, and that's who I'm now working with as the research coordinator. So a bit more about the One Health Breakthrough Partnership. It's bringing together key regional and national stakeholders across the healthcare, the environment, and the water sector in Scotland. And it's focused on addressing the issue of pharmaceutical pollution in the environment. 4 agencies make up our steering group, and each agency has a strategic interest in addressing pharmaceutical pollution. So SEPA, as the environment regulator, has a statutory purpose to protect and improve surface water quality. Scottish Water is responsible for treating our wastewater and providing safe and clean drinking water. And the Environmental Research Institute of the University of the Highlands and Islands has a specialized research background in monitoring and modeling environmental contamination and pollution. And NHS Highland, as a healthcare provider, has a responsibility to ensure that it offers safe and effective healthcare that does not negatively impact the environment, which we rely on for ecosystem services. So the partnership has a vision for a non-toxic environment and is working together through innovation, cross-sector engagement, and knowledge exchange to reduce the environmental impact of our healthcare practices. And we're working through sustainable upstream interventions, and also researching the state of pollution in Scotland's water environment. And you can read more about the work that we've been carrying out through the link here at the bottom of this slide. But recently, the partnership has received funding from the Scottish Government's Water Industry Division to take forward our activity, as our objectives are closely aligned with Scotland's environment, water, and hydronation goals. And we particularly can contribute to priorities around the Sustainable Development Goals and safeguarding the state of our environment and water resources. So you can follow this link here to learn more about Scotland becoming the world's first hydronation. But you can see that we are working with stakeholders and representatives in the Scottish government, and we're working to discuss the need for a policy statement and potential regulation on pharmaceuticals entering the environment, as these compounds are currently not regulated through European Union or UK legislation. So through this partnership, we are bringing together researchers, industry representatives, and the public sector to work towards evidence-based policy to tackle the environmental, the economic, the regulatory, and the healthcare issues around pharmaceutical pollution in the environment. So you heard how I went from actively performing research during my PhD as a hydronation scholar to developing ways now to work with stakeholders and policymakers to reduce pharmaceutical pollution in Scotland. And yes, I provided all the links here for what I've spoken about in this video, and thanks very much for your attention. And I'll hand over to Stuart now.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lydia, for your talk. Just a little bit about me before we crack on. My name is Stuart Housden, and for the last 15, 18 years, I was a board member of RSPB and was the director of RSPB Scotland. But I've worked for the RSPB for 40 years, and during that time, I built the NGO's lobbying capacity. I constructed programs to implement things like the Birds Directive in Europe and Brussels, worked quite closely on the Habitats Directive with DG Environment and drafted sections of that. I was also instrumental as part of the team to bring about environmental assessment and the EA directive, both for individual projects and at strategic level. I did a lot of work in Westminster prior to my moving to Scotland in the mid-90s, and had quite a number of successes in drafting private bills and amending legislation. One or two examples I'll mention briefly in my presentation. And of course, in Scotland, worked very hard. A lot of my work was working at senior level with civil servants, ministers and MSPs and so forth to try and influence policy and the implementation of policy, but also make changes and to try and change the policy debate and, where possible, influence legislation and bring in new ideas. So that's my background. First and secondly, I'd like to say that the RSPB, and indeed I think most NGOs, want to work with scientists to ensure that the ideas they have are founded in good science and good data, as well as make practical sense. And the RSPB itself employs over 70 postdoc staff in its Centre for Conservation Science, and has an extremely good publications record, which would be the envy of many university biology or zoology departments. So science is core, and it's really important to have the backing of good science and evidence when making the case to change public policy or influence legislation. So I think the other thing I'd want to stress is that many of you, at different parts of your careers, you may be overawed by approaching parliamentarians and having discussions which could be bracketed as lobbying or advocacy. And I just want to be absolutely clear that you should not be, and that you've got to remember that you are well-researched, articulate, able people. And if you do end up giving evidence in front of a committee or meeting an MSP or minister as part of a team, you will know infinitely more about the subject, which is why you're there, than the people who will be, as it were, interrogating you or asking questions. And I think you should therefore be confident, but concise, calm, clear, and hone in on the things that really matter, that the areas where you want policy to be changed or new initiatives to be taken. And I think as well, there's nothing at all wrong with a bit of passion to show that you care about this sort of thing. You are a human being, and the subject matter need not be cold and antiseptic. It can be something that rouses passions. So if you are going to be involved directly or as part of a team in lobbying for policy change, I think it's very important, as we've heard from other speakers, and I won't stress it too much, but to map out a plan of activity and plan of action. I've seen far too many people, because they're a learned professor, got a perspective, they fire off something to the newspaper or they write to the minister with the thing that concerns them, but have done no preparation whatsoever. And this is not going to work. It's doomed to fail. You need to map out the people that are necessary to try and influence and also seek their views on your ideas. This is what lobbying is all about. So we've heard already that ministers are protected by groups of civil servants. They listen to party as well as to the civil service around key issues. They rely on information from bodies like SPRE, NatureScot and others to try and interpret what is being put to them. And there is a sort of process that ideas are tested and evidence and data are looked at. And you need to sort of map that out for your subject area so that you can start work by, as it were, preparing the ground, making your case to the civil servants who handle that area of policy, seeking the views and input from NatureScot, Marine Scotland and other key NDPBs, and taking advice from other stakeholders that may share your concerns to try and build a programme that is more likely to succeed. And policy change, and particularly legislative change, doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long haul to try and achieve it. And one of the reasons it takes a long haul is that there is always people whose perspectives are different to yours. They may be stakeholders who benefit from the current policy. For example, farm payments are a highly disputed area. If you're the National Farmers Union of Scotland, you will be lobbying and have access to ministers and MSPs and civil servants around public payment schemes, and you look very cautiously and indeed suspiciously around change to those, and the redirection of money, say, to nature-related projects or environmental payments, for public goods, is a highly disputed area. Now, understanding that and trying to find opportunities to collaborate and where areas and solutions can be paid for which meet both the needs of stakeholders affected like that and the nature outcomes that we want are, I think, pretty important and vital, again, to map out. As is building alliances. If it's just one organisation or one group asking for these changes, is less likely to succeed than if there's a broad alliance. And this is where working as NGOs through things like Scottish Environment Link can be very helpful. And I've put up in the chat one recent campaign that I was involved in drafting the campaign document for, which gives an illustration of the sort of joint work that can happen. So all too often, ecologists and scientists will assume that because they produced a nice piece of peer-reviewed research and got it published, that in a sense that will then inevitably lead to the changes that you've identified that are needed. And sadly, all too often, those scientists are going to be disappointed for all the reasons I've outlined, and indeed you've heard of before. And I'll give an example from history. Some of you may have heard of Rachel Carson, who in 1962 published a seminal work called Silent Spring, which identified the fact that certain persistent agrochemicals, the family of organochlorine chemicals, were entering the food chains of nature, and that birds in particular were suffering hugely and were declining very rapidly because of the use by farmers of these chemicals. DDT was one, but also aldrin, dieldrin and heptachlor. So in the late 60s, the RSPB, BTO and what's now known as NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council, funded lots of work to investigate all of this, and learned reports were produced in the 60s which really did point the finger at the damaging effect of organochlorines. And yet, because of dispute from the agricultural sector and science itself disagreeing where the benefits lay for the future, it wasn't until 1984 that DDT was finally withdrawn for use in the UK, and indeed dieldrin and aldrin didn't disappear until the mid-90s. So you've got to be in it for the long haul to get change in disputed matters where science was being argued about as much as the policy and the impact on economics. So at the end of the day, there is nothing better than sound science and sound evidence to help us. So that's really, really very important. I think the other thing I would stress is you should look for opportunities, and these opportunities come often by actions elsewhere. So the two directives I mentioned, the Birds Directive and the Habitats Directive, and also the EA Directive, led to legislative changes here in the UK, both in Westminster and also in the devolved parliaments and assemblies. And that means you can be looking ahead and actively lobbying to say, well, this directive has come in, we will need new legislation or new policy or new practice to meet it. And you can position yourself as an organisation or a group of scientists who've got the information to help the desk officers in the civil service to produce the results. And you can be ahead of the game. And being ahead of the game in all of this is much, much more important than being a follower. So if you can influence how the agenda of government and political parties and parliament works, then you're much more likely to be successful. So knowing that these things are coming along is vital. And a lot of people today have spoken about giving evidence before committees and things of that sort, all of which I absolutely endorse and I won't repeat. But if you can set the agenda, get your ideas in the programme for government, get your ideas into the green paper or white paper or the consultation documents, that is much more likely to lead to success. Because if you're coming along afterwards, giving evidence or suggesting changes, there's already a commitment, as it were, to do the things that you were consulted upon, and it's quite hard to get changes introduced. And I'll give you, again, one example from history on that, where it was successfully achieved. The implementation of the Birds Directive in the early 1980s in Westminster led ultimately to the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, which for the first time offered protection to SSSIs, all SSSIs. But the Department of Environment then consulted in its white paper on protecting about 25 of them as Natura sites, and the rest would carry on as normal. And it was only by persuading the then Nature Conservancy Council to review the evidence of damage being done to SSSIs, of which there were about 6,500 across the Great Britain, and 11% were damaged in the year before the introduction of the Wildlife and Countryside Bill to Parliament. 11%, largely by agriculture and forestry, which largely was untouched by having an SSSI. So getting the then NCC to change its advice to government and say that it needed more protection was absolutely vital. And there was a hard effort led by a consortium of peers and MPs to persuade the NCC to publish this evidence, which was crucial at the time to bringing about this radical change of protecting all SSSIs through a process called reciprocal notification, Section 28 of the Act, which is still largely in place. So it's absolutely vital to get the NDPBs on board. And I have to say, I find it hard to imagine today with both Westminster government and the Scottish government that they would smile kindly on the NDPB, whether it be NatureScot or SPRE or the equivalents, Natural England, that sort of thing, changing their mind and countering what the government of the day had consulted upon. Almost impossible to believe, and it was pretty difficult then to get that through as well. So I think the key points I'd ask you to note are advanced preparation to build an alliance of like-minded bodies is important. And whatever sphere you'll end up working in or are already working in, there are other agencies and other organisations who will share your concerns and views, especially if the evidence you produce is discussed with them. And it's important to talk to the NDPBs and key parliamentarians about what you've found before you progress to the next stages. So it's important to present your evidence, have it as a discussion document, put it out in the published literature, so that you can then talk to people about it. And then you can start to harness groundswell of support to make the changes that you need. The second thing is there's no point in having a fantastic bit of science and information and then just bombarding MSPs or committee members with it. You need to build links well before the need of making an ask of them. So summer tours, chances to show them projects, invite them to participate with you, let them get to know you and respect you. And then it's easier to have the ask about things that you would like them to take up on your behalf. So mapping out the interested parties, mapping out who might support you, and also building contacts, as we've heard already from SPICE and taking advice, etc., is, I think, a really crucial way of getting success. And I think it's all important as well to understand the motivations of those who may, at some stage in the future, challenge you. And in the land using industries, that's obviously going to be the NFUS, forestry interests, etc., etc. And what happens to land is vital for nature and for biodiversity. What happens at sea is the same, but there's large numbers of interested parties, well represented, with strong links to parliamentarians, which you have to try and influence. And sometimes these organisations, when faced with change, do react and are hostile to it. So this can be quite disputatious. And I think it's fair to say that we, as picking up on the point that we've heard already from NatureScot, we're often too quick to sort of say, well, we're not 100% confident about that. That wouldn't be the way the National Farmers Union or some of these others approach matters. They would just say, you know, until you're 100% certain, we don't want to know about this, because we're 100% certain you're right. And then look at the arguments around the fisheries policy and the total allowable catches and that go on each year. The science is consistently ignored because of the strength of lobbying and the public pressure that is put on ministers. And we mustn't forget that that is the case. And lobbying, from a nature point of view, is done to try and build on the strength that we have, which may well be both the science and good evidence, but also the contacts and support we have through the NGO movement to hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens who are concerned. We may need to harness that at the appropriate time. So judicious use of press briefings, champions to help the cause, and understanding our opponents' perspectives, I think, are going to be pretty important. So to sum up, ideally, the lobbyist is there to create opportunities. Got to work out who's writing the manifestos in advance of elections, seek meetings, get to know them, showcase your ideas with them, present them as attractive ideas that will win public support. Once things are in a manifesto and they then translate into a programme for government, you are 2/3 of the way there. You may not get what you want, but that is how the big industry, bodies like the National Farmers Union, Confederation of Forest Industries, all of the big sectors, they're in there doing that sort of thing. And so you should be supporting that type of activity right at the outset. You need to get close to those who can help give you access to Parliament or to the civil servants before you ask them to do something. It's you know, common sense, really. You're building a human relationship. So do try and show them your project, showcase them, give them opportunities on the summer tours to come and see you, and get to know the civil servants who lead on the regulatory or administrative end of your issues and the policy implementation. Discuss your ideas with them. Be open about what you're trying to achieve. Listen to the arguments they give you back, because that is a reflection of the political balance that Jeanette showed us in one of her slides that's going on. Do take advice from SPICE. Do talk to people in other NGOs or in other sectors who've gone through similar things before. And if a green or white paper is proposed, go and meet the drafting team. Get your ideas and evidence before them, because it's far harder to get an idea accepted after it's published than it is before it's published. So it's like a draft paper that you may produce for publication. If you discuss the ideas that you have with colleagues and implement them, include them first, it's a lot easier to do that than an anonymous reviewer says, why didn't it do this? You know, it's harder for you to build it in. It's the same with policy and with lobbying. You've got to be even-handed with people. You've got to give praise when governments or ministers or MSPs do actually do what you ask them to do. Too often we go away and congratulate ourselves, but we don't actually say thank you for people who've perhaps taken a risk, upset another interest group or stakeholder or lobbyist, and had moved towards you. And you know, it's right that you be even-handed, criticise when that is necessary, but praise and thank when it's done. And lastly, I'd say don't forget the opposition in all of this, or the committee MSPs, as we've heard, and I was going to talk about that, but we've done it. The opposition can be a point of, when you've tried all the direct approaches, can be a point where you can keep your issue alive, and any embarrassing information, as it were, can be exposed, or ministers kept constantly reminded that there is a problem with current policy or the way it's being implemented, or new data suggests that new legislation might be right. Okay, thank you very much indeed.